Good morning, Mr. Harrower. Miss Graham.
Good morning, Mr. Harrower. I'd like to ask you some questions, continuing with the issue of family liaison. And could we look at your first inquiry statement, please? SBPI 00259. And if we can look at paragraph 36. And I'm interested in looking at who is responsible for deploying the FLOs. So we see here that this is your inquiry statement, and you say, in a PIRC investigation, there would be a firm expectation that Police Scotland family liaison officers were deployed. Then, if there was a need for PIRC flows to be deployed, then that would potentially be a day or two after. I can't be more specific than that because it will depend on the circumstances, and a lot of communication and dialogue would need to take place between the PIRC appointed flows and the Police Scotland flows. But a definite expectation that Police Scotland flows would be deployed first. To a great extent, that's still the case in relation to flows. There will be a period where Police Scotland will initiate that process, and then there will be a formal communication and handover with the family for our flows to have to take on that role. You see that? So you seem to be saying here in your inquiry statement that there was a firm expectation, a definite expectation on the part of PIRC, on the part of you, that Police Scotland flows would be deployed initially.
At that time, yes. Yeah. That's changed slightly, but it still occurs that Police Scotland flows are deployed at the outset of a critical incident. Not all the time, but it does still happen regularly.
Can you explain to what extent it's changed?
There will be on occasions, depending on the circumstances and geographically where the incident is. I'm aware that flows from the PIRC side have been deployed from the outset, but I don't know on how many occasions that's been, but certainly at that time that was the normal process, that the Police Scotland flows would be deployed initially, and then subsequently there would be a decision made whether PIRC flows were required. They would then get a detailed briefing and handover from Police Scotland formally to the family to then take on that role for the full extent of the investigation.
And when did the position change in relation to sometimes PIRC flows go in first?
I couldn't give you a definitive date on that. I'm not sure. I'm quite sure Alistair Lewis would be able to confirm that as the PIRC coordinator.
We'll ask Mr. Lewis. And you've obviously experienced both options, the PIRC flows going in now, maybe first, and in 2015 it was the Police Scotland flows, yes, who would go. Can you, in your experience, see any advantages or disadvantages of PIRC flows going in first? Again,
it would depend on their availability. On some occasions, flows would not be deployed on the first day of an incident at all. Again, depending on where that is, if they're seen as a need for flows immediately, then obviously it would have to be weighed up where they were deployed to, what the family position was, and you know the time considerations in relation to that.
If assuming a PIRC flow was available now, they're geographically available and in a suitable location, and the family position is, for whatever reason, amenable to a PIRC flow being in attendance.
Yep.
Are there, in regard to that set of circumstances, are there any advantages of sending the PIRC flows in first, straight away?
Oh, arguably, I would think from continuity, right from the beginning, as far as I think we touched on that briefly yesterday as regards the family being introduced to these, some level of trust and good communication being built up to maintain that.
Can you see any disadvantages in the PIRC flows going in first?
The flow is a major part of the flow deployment. Prior to that is them having a full awareness of that stage of the investigation at that time, even if it's an early stage. That's why the handover to individuals is very significant, that is not done too quickly, because they're obviously the conduit with the family and the investigation itself. And there's a requirement for them to be confident in the information that they have and that they're kept up to date with the investigation and communicate relevant information to the family representatives.
So the quality of that handover or the
is very
timing
important.
could be a possible disadvantage.
So it's not only getting flows out and deployed, it's then having the capability for them to be appropriately briefed. That's probably why the Police Scotland flows quite regularly, particularly at that time, were deployed initially. The availability, the expertise to be briefed and deployed as soon as practical.
So sending out PIRC flows at an early stage could be a disadvantage depending on a number of factors, including the quality of the handover, the briefing they have, the information that's available.
Yeah, you would
to
hope
them.
that collectively there would be sufficient information to administer that briefing depending on the availability of individuals. And obviously on the day the Police Scotland flows were there, and I understand that update to them and briefing had taken place at some late stage in the afternoon.
Thank you. Can we look now please at SBPI 00258, which is an inquiry statement from Gary McEwen. And if we could look at paragraph 86. And here Gary McEwen has said, he's talking about the flows and he's talking about the background to this. He said it's important because by the time I got involved with the family directly, now we've heard evidence, and we discussed this yesterday, that Gary McEwen had visited the family on
Yes.
the 3rd of May. So by the time I got involved with the family directly, there was already a great deal of anger and upset. PIRC were responsible for family liaison. My point of contention in this case is that they weren't dealing with it properly. I felt like I needed to see the family because it wasn't at the forefront of PIRC's mind. On the day in question, they didn't have the flows out. They weren't even on duty. That wasn't good enough. I raised it a couple of times directly with PIRC. Their recommendation was, it is fine, we'll see them tomorrow. I disagreed. I said we can't leave the family overnight. They needed to be briefed and made aware. It was wholly inappropriate. And so in this paragraph, as you see from Gary McEwen's statement, he seems to be of the view that PIRC were responsible for family liaison. And I'm wondering if you can help the chair and perhaps shed some light on this apparent mismatch between your view that Police Scotland were responsible and Gary McEwen's view that PIRC were responsible for deploying the flows.
It was clear at that time that Police Scotland had taken on that responsibility, and that was from the early discussions I had with Pat Campbell, and he confirmed that that process was ongoing, that the flows had been contacted and were en route at that time, and then subsequently arrived at Kirkcaldy Police Station. As I mentioned just a short time ago, that I think they'd got as far as being briefed in relation to the incident.
And so the early discussions that you'd had with Pat Campbell had led you to believe that Police Scotland had accepted the responsibility to deploy flows.
Very much so, and that was confirmed at the Gold Group meeting as well, and that's referred to, I think, in the discussions that were had, that that was ongoing, and that the flows had been identified, who these officers were.
We looked at the minutes yesterday, I think. I wonder if you would help me with the guidance that was available at that time to help assist the chair understand what was available to Police Scotland and PIRC. Can we look at the position of Police Scotland first of all? I understand there may be 2 SOPs that may be applicable to this type of situation, and I think the simplest way of showing this is by looking at a statement by Kevin Houliston. Do you know the name Kevin Houliston?
Yes, I know Kevin Houliston. Yeah.
And I think he was a flow.
Yes, he was. He was one of the 2 flows. Yeah.
Right, so let's look at SBPI 00354. This is an inquiry statement that Mr. Houliston has provided to the inquiry. And I'd like to look at 2 paragraphs, 47 and 49. Hopefully we can see both of them on the screen. Now, the 47 says, I'm now referred to the Police Scotland Death or Serious Injury in Police Custody Standard Operating Procedure 2013 at paragraph 5.8. And this is set out, the terms of that paragraph are set out. The PIRC may elect to deploy their own flows. However, it may be that for logistical reasons, a police flow will require to be deployed in the initial stages. Discussions and careful negotiations will take place between the PIRC senior investigator and the SIO. Ideally, an independent flow will be deployed. So that seems to be a SOP, a Police Scotland SOP from 2013. I don't know if you've ever seen that before.
I don't recall. I read it now.
And then if we can look at paragraph 49, there's another SOP referred to here. Police Scotland Family Liaison SOP. This is from the next year, 2014, and the reference is to paragraph 6.1.2, where Crown Office has directed an independent investigation in the case of deaths in police custody. Fully trained independent family liaison officers will be deployed by the senior investigator of the Police Investigation and Review Commission. So on this occasion, in this SOP, it seems to be saying that for an investigation where PIRC are appointed to look into a death in police custody, which is the scenario that you were in on the 3rd of May, that flows will be deployed by the senior investigator of PIRC. Have you ever come across this SOP in your dealings?
No, I don't recall
No.
reading it now.
Let's now look at the position of PIRC in terms of the guidance. Can we look at PIRC 03885? Now this is a document, a PIRC document in relation to family liaison. And we'll get that up on the screen. You see that it's headed up Family Liaison Officer, and we can see that the author is Alistair Lewis, who I believe is a flow. We're hoping to hear from him later in the inquiry. And you'll see that the date published is 24th of June 2015. So this is the month after the events at Hayfield Road on the 3rd of May. Now, we haven't heard from Alistair Lewis in evidence yet, but my understanding is that he will say there was an earlier version of this document. This document is the closest the inquiry have to that earlier version, and I understand he'll give evidence that there's consistency there. Can we look at page 2, please? And this relates to the deployment, sorry, we've just passed it, thank you. Deployment of a PIRC flow. And it says here, the PIRC will normally deploy a flow in circumstances where there has been a death following police contact and where there is an identifiable family. And it goes on to say the PIRC may also deploy flow in other circumstances. So there's three versions of SOPs effectively here. There's the two police SOPs and the PIRC document. And the variations seem to be a PIRC flow will be deployed, a PIRC flow will normally be deployed, or PIRC may elect to deploy a flow or may not, in which case Police Scotland will be required to deploy a flow. They all seem to have slight variations in terms of the guidance that's being given
Yes.
to PIRC and to the police service. From my reading of these, and hopefully Mr. Lewis will give us more information about this, none of these documents spell out the position if flows are simply not available, and none of them are entirely aligned with the guidance given to the other organisation. There's no specific guidance covering a situation where Police Scotland elect not to deploy flows, as you've been talking about at the Gold Group meeting. Do you, looking at all of this now in this cold light of day, do you think that this may have contributed to some confusion in the parts of police and PIRC in relation to what should have been happening with the flows?
I think on the day there was no confusion from either our side or Police Scotland's side on what was actually going to happen in relation to family liaison officers until obviously that broke down at the later stages in the evening. So that was clear from the outset that, you know, that decision was made that flows were being deployed and who they were at that stage. There'd be a full intention from the PIRC side to deploy our flows probably at an early stage, but not that day, and that was arrangements were put in place on the day.
So from your perspective, it was agreed, it had been discussed and agreed, Police Scotland flows would be deployed on the 3rd of May, PIRC flows would come in at a later stage.
My understanding, there's no dispute over that. That was clearly understood on both sides and was happening because they subsequently did attend the office ready to deploy.
And then, as you say, that arrangement broke down.
Yes.
And I think yesterday you explained that you first became aware of that breaking down at the Gold Group meeting.
Yes.
The 8:15 in the evening, or
yes.
in the evening. That was the 3rd Gold Group meeting. Can I ask you about the ability to secure the services of flows?
Yeah.
Now, can we look at your second statement? That's SBPI 00382. And this is paragraph 65. And you're asked here, you're asked to refer to your operational notes. Do you still have the hard copy of those in your blue folder? And you're asked to look at page 6 of those. And this related to your note of the Gold Group meeting at 14:05, this question says. So it was the one in the afternoon,
Yep.
I think. We looked at the minutes yesterday, they were timed 14:40.
Yep.
And it said flows deployment soon. So this was in the afternoon of the 3rd of May. And you were noting in your operational notes, flows deployment soon. Following the Gold Group meeting at 14:05 hours, you're then asked, what was your understanding of Police Scotland's deployment of the flows? And you say here, at the conclusion of the Gold Group meeting, my clear understanding was that Police Scotland intended to deploy flows imminently and that the family would be made aware of the death. The flows were later identified as DS Kevin Hoolison and Jane Bell. PIRC flows would not have been deployed that day. They would have been identified at the earliest the following day, that would be the 4th of May, with a view to a planned briefing and formal handover of responsibility between the PIRC and Police Scotland flows. And I think that's what you were describing earlier.
Yes.
It was imperative that the Police Scotland flows were deployed as soon as practicable on the 3rd of May to engage with the family.
Yes.
And that was your clear understanding after that Gold Group meeting.
Yes.
That was the first Gold Group meeting that you'd attended.
That's correct.
And certainly from the note that you've made in your operational statement, you were under the impression they were being deployed imminently. Can I just check, I asked you this yesterday, but when we look at your operational notes, can you confirm those were either prepared at the time of events happening or shortly after?
Yes.
And does that apply to all of the notes?
Yes.
Right, thank you. So, did you, after that Gold Group meeting, did you feel reassured that that matter was in hand and arrangements?
Yes, certainly.
Was there any indication after that meeting that things were changing or matters had moved on?
Not to my knowledge. It was obviously clearly a surprise when, I say, the first indication from memory was at the next Gold Group meeting that it came out of the blue.
Let's look at the minutes for the next Gold Group meeting, please. This is PSO 3139. And so this is the minutes we looked at yesterday from a Gold Group meeting at around 8:15 in the evening. So it's around 6 hours later. And if we could look at page 2, item 5 on the agenda is entitled Family Concerns. And you'll see here that it says, Chief Superintendent McEwen discussed brother-in-law of deceased. He is part of an independent advisory group and had advised the initial attending officers that he knew Mr. McEwen and requested that he attend and speak with him within 24 hours. Chief Superintendent and Chief Inspector Shepherd attended at home address of next of kin, highly charged environment, deceased's partner Colette and extended family within. Family concerned the early contact they had was purposely vague. They were unhappy. They had not been told anything about who contacted the police and ambulance. Chief Superintendent provided them with an understanding of events. Chief Superintendent discussed the role of the PIRC and reassured them that it would not be P Division officers investigating the incident. We've heard evidence previously that P Division was Fife Police when
Yes.
it was a legacy force. And then task family crave reassurance and are asking about witnesses, etc. They do not wish anything publicised until they inform deceased mother who is in London. Who was it that spoke to item 5 on the agenda? Do you remember?
I'm sure it was Mr. McEwen.
Right. Had you been made aware prior to this meeting that Chief Superintendent McEwen had visited with the family? Were you aware of that before this meeting?
Yeah, I think I was, because I know that during his evidence he's already said that we had a discussion. I don't specifically remember the discussion, but he mentioned that I had suggested it might not be a good idea to go to the house, and certainly in the circumstances, not knowing exactly what the family's request specifically was, that clearly from my perspective it would be a lot better that the flows took on that visit and initial discussion. But I say I don't know the specifics around his personal visit and how strong the family were in wanting that to happen.
Why did you think it would be better for the Flows to have a discussion with the family?
Because they're fully trained to deal with these situations, they would be aware of what information to pass, what they're satisfied was appropriate in the circumstances. Obviously, during his visit, I'm aware that there was additional information given regarding the incident, which was different from both the previous visits that were made by other officers.
And you're aware of that?
Yes.
From evidence from the inquiry?
Yes.
Can we look at your first statement, SBPI 00259, please? Paragraph 45. Thank you. Now, this is in connection with the Gold Group meeting, chaired by ACC Nicholson. And you say, my statement notes that we were advised by Gary McEwen that he had recently returned from visiting Mr. Bio's family. He explained that the family had significant concerns over information disclosed to them by representatives of Police Scotland, resulting in a perceived mistrust of local police. And there was a highly charged atmosphere, and the family were not happy with disclosure of information by the police. The family think the relative was murdered, and they have distrust of local officers. And you were asked to comment on that. When was it you were made aware that the family had significant concerns about and did not trust the local police?
I'm sure that was in the feedback during the Gold Group meeting.
So you hadn't been told that
I
prior
don't recall any conversation I'd been made aware in any detail before that. Don't discount it's a possibility, but I certainly don't recall it that way.
Right. So at that Gold Group meeting, was this the first time that you became aware that the family did have significant concerns?
Yes.
In relation to Police Scotland officers? Did that change the view about the benefits of sending Police Scotland Flows to see the family?
Well, I think from what's recorded there, the distrust was in relation to local officers. The Flows that had been delegated, I understand, are not local officers that come from, I think, other legacy force areas, so they're out with the Fife area altogether.
Did you see a distinction between the family's views of local officers or Fife officers, Kirkcaldy officers, and the Flows, the Police Scotland Flows from a different area?
Oh, I'm unaware of what their general understanding would be of saying local officers, whether that meant they had a perception that it would be officers from Kirkcaldy or the Fife area that would be dealing with that. I could understand that.
Certainly, it says here, significant concerns over information disclosed to them by representatives of Police Scotland, resulting in a perceived mistrust of local police. Did you see their concerns as being very much targeted towards the local police?
Yes.
Rather than a wider view of Police Scotland officers?
Yeah, it's mentioned on a couple of occasions during that update that it is focused apparently on local officers.
And so if the Police Scotland Flows were from out with the local area, what benefits did you consider there would remain if they were deployed to the family?
Well, from the family perspective, I dare say that they would mention where they came from, so they would try and negate any of that trust as regards you know, they would have an explanation of where they were from, and once they heard the concerns of the family.
Did you have any sense, either before the Gold Group meeting or at that Gold Group meeting, that your views and the views of Police Scotland, the senior officers, were now diverging in relation to the deployment of Police Scotland flows?
They certainly were in relation to the deployment of the flows. I don't know whose decision ultimately it was to cancel that full arrangement, but obviously that was done.
Let's look for a moment back at the minutes that we looked at, the third Gold Group meeting minutes, PSO 3139, and we'll move on to page 3. And we're looking at the top of page 3. And it says, Chief Superintendent, that's Gary McEwen, discusses initial decision to have Police Scotland flows, but now hand over to PIRC flows for arrangement to gain entry to house of deceased, recollecting belongings for child. Discussion re initial contact on phone from PIRC. Can you tell us some of the background to this topic of discussion? Was this the point, was it Gary McEwen that indicated the initial decision to have Police Scotland flows deployed was now being changed?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know where the understanding, there seemed to be a thread of understanding that, you know, that PIRC flows, as a result of the action that was taken, would then come out. That was never going to happen that evening. The kind of late hour was wholly impractical for that to then occur.
If it had been agreed that PIRC flows would come out earlier in the day, would that have been possible?
It may have been possible.
We'll maybe come back to that. But was this is the point where you heard that Police Scotland flows were no longer going to be deployed?
Yes.
In light of that, did you take any steps to see whether it was possible for a PIRC flow or PIRC flows to be deployed, even though it was after 8 in the evening?
I think I said in my statement, I certainly took stock of the situation after that Gold Group meeting, thought about the alternatives to do that. But I say, given the time in the evening, even if I was able to get in contact with someone immediately and then make arrangements to come out, realistically it could potentially be the early hours of the morning, which in the circumstances I didn't think was appropriate at all. Even, you know, and that's what focused my mind on going to see the family with my colleague and try and take things forward, explain to them the situation, what was going to happen, details as regards potential plans for the post-mortem, because that was always moving closer to that point.
So was your decision to speak to the family, was that because there were no flows going to see the family?
I would have probably done that late in the evening anyway, after the flows had deployed and spoken to the family, and then by way of introduction and explanation. Certainly at that time there was limited knowledge with the police on what our full functions were, but significantly so with members of the public, so it was appropriate to let them know what our function was, give them some assurance as regards how that independent inquiry would be conducted, and that we were a separate agency altogether from the police service.
You say in your statement that when you found out about the Police Scotland flows no longer being deployed, you were extremely displeased about
Yes,
that.
very much so, because I mean this had been in place for some time, that whole day, and you know, in the circumstances, particularly with the apparent misinformation that had been passed to them in the first place, that there was a need for somebody to act as that point in liaison and have that training and knowledge to conduct the communications in a proper fashion.
Can we look at your second statement, SBPI 00382, paragraph 104? Again, you're being asked about the situation at the time of that third gold group meeting. And you say, we'll look at the bottom, I understand that the sudden change in decision not to deploy Police Scotland flows was made by Chief Superintendent McEwen. I did not agree with this position, and I felt it was inappropriate to take this decision at that juncture. I am sure that I expressed my disagreement and frustration on the decision to Chief Superintendent McEwen and others after the Gold Group meeting. However, I can't be more specific on how and to who. In my view, this decision was very detrimental to attempts to engage with Mr. Bio's family and led to further frustration on their part moving forward. I'm interested in the part where you say the decision was very detrimental to attempts to engage with Mr. Bio's family. You said it led to further frustration. Were you concerned about the possible detriment to Mr. Bio's family?
Yes, of course I was, and obviously at that stage we were aware that the post-mortem was going to take place the following day, so the flows would have a significant role in that process and explaining that process and making arrangements.
And in terms of you're obviously the lead investigator, you're conducting a PIRC investigation. From the perspective of that investigation, what impact, if any, did this decision have on the investigation itself?
On the wider investigation?
Yes.
I think that at the early stage, I think the biggest impact would be on the family and the lack of flow of information. Particularly, there was a lot of things happening at that time. They were specifically dealing with the grief and the circumstances of the death of Mr. Bio, and then we'd be having to make decisions to meet the request as regards the next stages of the investigation.
We've heard evidence that an investigation can benefit from that flow of information from families.
Yes.
Which can often, flows can be a conduit for that. Is that something that you recognise as being a positive benefit?
They are the conduit for that. They're there to assist the family with advice and communication, but also to assist the investigation itself.
We've also heard evidence that from Pat Campbell in relation to this matter, and he gave some explanation of the reasoning behind Police Scotland's decision that the family were refusing to engage, they were not wanting to speak to Police Scotland officers at that time or any local officers. I think it was as well was the fact, I'm quoting from his evidence at the moment, the discussion with Rory Nicholson and myself, Leslie Bowl, Gary McEwen was around, and Keith Harrower obviously involved in that as well, was that are we going to gain anything further here, or is it just simply going to aggravate an already sensitive matter by deploying now Police Scotland flows to the family? So we were all in agreement with that. The fact is we didn't think there was any benefit at that stage of deploying Police Scotland flows because of the situation we found ourselves in to move forwards. And at that stage it was Gary McEwen being deployed to the family to try to basically explain a bit more about the incident. And after the Gold Group, Keith Harrower and the direction at the time from the ACC around the fact that PIRC would deploy flows. and Keith Harrower would make contact with the family. As far as you're aware, was the decision not to deploy flows actually made at the Gold Group meeting?
My understanding it would have been made before that, but I wasn't party to that at that stage.
Did you feel during that Gold Group meeting that you were taking part in a discussion where it was being considered whether to deploy Police Scotland flows?
No, to my mind, from my recollection, that decision had already been made, and that was the presentation of that update was at that stage. So I was taken unawares by that.
So your impression was that it was not a discussion with that the outcome had been predetermined?
No. And that, you know, there wasn't an overall agreement on that, because I didn't agree with it.
And did you make it clear at that meeting you didn't agree with that?
After it, I think not. I can't remember what input or dialogue I had during the meeting, because we were obviously taken aback at that stage of what had actually occurred.
And because you felt taken aback, you didn't make your own views clear?
I can't recall specifically what I said in the confines of the meeting itself.
We've also heard from Gary McEwen in relation to this. He had written in a statement that he was informed after this Gold Group meeting that you had no staff available to attend the house, but you personally would telephone the family. But I think you've said already you actually went to visit the family.
Yeah, I think I had possibly 2 phone calls initially to make that introduction and to see when it would be suitable to go and visit them that evening. And that arrangement was subsequently made.
Were there any steps taken by you that evening to see whether you could muster some PIRC flows
No.
to visit the family?
No, I made it, given the hour in the day, that I didn't see any practical advantage to anyone in the circumstances.
Did you agree with Gary McEwen's comments, which I read out to you earlier, they were on the screen, that waiting 24 hours before a family are given a thorough, proper update on the circumstances? Do you agree that is inappropriate to delay?
In relation to the flow, is this in relation to the flows?
But to wait 24 hours before giving the family a thorough and proper update, that would be inappropriate?
Yeah, but they should be given as much information as appropriate in the circumstances at that time. And they'd obviously been provided with a lot of information at different stages from Police Scotland during the course of that evening.
You've been asked a question about, it's in your first inquiry statement, I don't think we need to go to it, but you've been asked if there was ever any discussion with Pat Campbell about a joint deployment of flows, so a Police Scotland flow and a PIRC flow.
Yeah.
And do you remember any discussions of that sort taking place?
No,
with Pat
definitely
Campbell?
not.
Is that something that you've experienced of in the past, where you have joint?
No, the only joint thing that I'd be aware of is the formal handover process that I described. The respective flows from the 2 organisations would have a very detailed handover, and then the flows would then introduce the new flows to the family and have that formal handover, and that would be the process.
So there would be some sort of physical introduction?
Yes, there would be.
And
normally, anyway. Yeah.
Right. And that's when the Police Scotland flows and PIRC flows would come together at that point.
Yes.
Thank you. In hindsight, do you think now that it might have been worth a phone call to the PIRC flows after that third Gold Group meeting to see if they were available?
Honestly, I don't think so. I said I did consider that, but for them to then, deploy within what could be a fairly lengthy timescale, particularly given what had gone before, that if they were to arrive and then attempts at back at midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning to be introduced to the family, I didn't think in the circumstances that was appropriate, so I didn't do it.
Did you take account of the fact there wouldn't need to be a handover as such?
There would be, because the flows would have to be briefed properly to what extent, if they would get a sufficient briefing to have a proper understanding of what information could be conveyed to the family, what had actually gone before in detail as regards any misinformation that had been passed. It would be appropriate for them to be aware of all of that. And again, given the time of night that they might attend, I would seriously question whether that would be achievable. So thus it would be counterproductive.
Could you maybe help us understand, you're obviously lead investigator, you're in charge of the investigation looking into the death of Mr. Bayo, and what information, if you'd been in that situation and if there had been flows available, what information would you have wanted the flows to share with the family on the 3rd of May?
If we had wanted them to share information that was confirmed 100%, anything conjecture or assessment of what may or may not have happened, to my mind, wouldn't be appropriate. It would have to be factual, i.e. that Mr. Bayo had come into contact with the police, there had been some form of restraint, and as a result, and that this independent investigation would be conducted thoroughly and come up with the answers of what actually happened to him during that.
And in terms of the circumstances after the restraint or during the restraint, would you have been in a position to give the family any information about that?
I think at that stage we didn't have sufficient information to say exactly what happened, so I wouldn't provide information that we could not substantiate, which would be counterproductive in the wider investigation.
So is that the extent really of what you would have told them, that he'd come into contact with the police, there'd been a restraint, and now PIRC had been brought in as an independent body to investigate? As you're aware, there was a variety of different pieces of information that we had at different stages, and none of this was absolutely confirmed, particularly with the officers that were involved in the restraint themselves. And there wasn't a lot of independent witness evidence at that stage, but obviously subsequently came through the inquiry, and potentially that would be fed in to the family at different stages where appropriate. And would you have felt comfortable giving them this information and no more?
It would depend on what it was, and I say I don't know at the different stages what it was, so I don't think it's appropriate to comment on that unless I knew exactly what it was.
Can I ask you about, can we look at the first Gold Group meeting minutes actually, which is PS 06491. This is the Gold Group meeting, the first one at 11:30 that morning. And can we look at item 3 on the agenda, which related to the investigative process? We've heard evidence that this was spoken to by Pat Campbell, who was the SIO. I'm interested there in the fourth bullet point, FLO establish a working strategy. Is establishing a working strategy something, this is the first gold group meeting, is this something at the forefront of an investigation which is commencing into an unexplained death?
Yeah, and what the flows would obviously have a significant input into that and how they were going to approach that.
Do you, as senior investigator or lead investigator, have an input into establishing a working strategy?
We would have an input into it in dialogue with the flows themselves.
And then can we look at the second gold group meeting minutes, which is PS 07268. And if we could look at item 5 on the agenda. This is headed up Family Concerns. And this is the second gold group meeting at 2:40. It says here, discussion re next of kin strategy identified as sister of deceased Colette Bell, girlfriend of deceased, is currently within Kirkcaldy Police Station and has been informed a deceased person is in hospital and that it may be her partner. Is a next of kin strategy the same as a flow strategy, or is it something different?
I would say it's something different.
Can you explain what the difference is?
I haven't actually seen the next of kin strategy, to be honest. What I can imagine what may be considered in it, but I don't know the specifics of it.
Have you ever seen a next of kin strategy?
Not physically, no.
Is it possible it's the same thing as a flow strategy?
I don't think so, no.
No. Is it a phrase you've ever used, next of kin?
I don't recollect using that before. No.
Tell us, in relation to the flow strategy then, what steps, if any, did you take to start to consider a flow strategy or formulate a flow strategy or prepare for flows arriving?
No, I didn't have any involvement in that.
That was nothing
No.
that you were involved in. Did you instruct anyone in your team to start thinking about a flow strategy?
No.
Was that not something that you felt should be prioritised?
Well, it was prioritised from the Police Scotland perspective, and they would take responsibility at that stage for that. And then once our flows were deployed, it would be a separate issue, would be our responsibility.
So was your expectation that Police Scotland would develop the flow strategy
Yes.
initially? And when would PIRC start developing their own flow strategy?
It would be the following day when Alistair Lewis was appointed from our organisations, and he would progress that from his perspective.
And was that something that, as part of his role as a flow, he would develop a
Yes.
flow strategy? And would you contribute to that if you'd been lead investigator the next day?
I probably would have done, but I wasn't, as you're aware.
I'm aware
Yeah.
of that, but is that something that you would have done
Yeah,
had
there
you
would be
continued?
dialogue between the lead investigator and him.
Right. Can I ask you about some issues relating to post-incident management? There was evidence given to this inquiry by Pat Campbell and by Conrad Trickett, who was the post-incident manager. I think we mentioned him yesterday.
Yes, we did.
And we've heard evidence that at some point before the first Gold Group meeting, prior to the meeting that Pat Campbell had with you, that he had a conversation with Conrad Trickett and indicated to him that statements were not required at this time. Now, do you have any recollection of having a conversation with Pat Campbell where you maybe indicated that statements were not required from the officers, the attending officers?
No, no recollection of that.
Can you help us understand, you're obviously PIM aware, post-incident procedures, you've had some awareness training in relation to that. What are basic facts?
Basic facts are kind of a short summary, general information given in the first instance after a critical incident, which is coming from the officers involved. So the PIM would basically put that together from the information that he had from the officer or group of officers at the time. So that's the first stage of that process.
We've heard evidence that there are 4 stages
Yes.
and there's basic facts, there's initial accounts. We've heard that detailed statements from officers would not be expected until perhaps 48 hours after the
That's
event.
correct, yeah.
Is that correct?
And that would be either scripted by the officers or members of police staff themselves, or invariably taken by PIRC investigators at that sort of, but it's on that sort of timescale.
And would you see a distinction between what we've heard are called operational statements, and officers have described self-penning or writing out their own statements of what happened at an event? They've called that an operational statement. A distinction between that and what may be called a witness statement, perhaps taken by a PIRC investigator.
No, I mean, an operational statement is a phrase. In my mind, a statement is a statement, and there may be, you know, a brief statement initially, but a more detailed statement covering the whole incident and actions and use of force, etc., would be more detailed. So I don't know whether they're referring to the operational statement is, in effect, at that stage, the initial account, which is normally written, which is a brief account of what occurred during the incident, and then I say that's followed up an early stage within that time period with a full detailed statement covering hopefully everything.
We may have heard, we have heard evidence from Conrad Trickett, who was the post-incident manager, that from his perspective there was no need to get basic facts from the officers because the basic facts were already known. Would you, from a PIRC perspective, do you take the view that the basic facts were already known during the day on the 3rd of May?
No, I don't think so, because, you know, initially there's differing accounts that I got of the incident. I know that was the case later as well, where there was things that never occurred were referred to. So through that process, that's definitive. You get the basic facts, you get the initial account, and you go to that final stage where you get the statement. So you don't deviate, would be my view, from that process if you were involved in the post-incident procedure. Whether there's a viewpoint that, you know, in general terms, that basic facts of the incident are already known.
Would, from the perspective of the PIRC investigation, would it have been of assistance to you to get basic facts?
Definitely, yes.
And then later initial accounts?
Yes.
And then ultimately more detailed statements?
Yeah, at a later stage.
Would that be some point after 48 hours after the incident?
Yeah, round about that would be normally the following, not the next day, but the following day. But you would already have some sort of account, as I say, within that initial account.
Thank you. Can I move on and ask you about the contact you had with the family on the evening of the 3rd of May? You said you made a couple of calls.
Yes.
And you then did visit the family.
I
that
did,
evening.
yes.
Can we look at SBPI 00259, and we'll have a look at, this is your inquiry statement, we'll have a look at paragraph 53. So you say, after the Gold Group meeting that evening, I made several unsuccessful attempts to contact Addie Johnson. About 21:45 hours, I spoke to Mr. Johnson by telephone and arranged to see him and other members of Sheku Bayo's family at Mr. Johnson's home. I then attended there at 22:10 hours. I was introduced to Mr. Johnson and requested to speak to him in private. When I went in, there was a large group there. My operational notes at page 9 record that there were approximately 16 to 18 other persons there, in addition to Caddy and Addie Johnson. I'm assuming some were family members, but I didn't know who everyone was. So to my mind, it was actually much more appropriate to meet one-to-one initially. If then I'd been requested to speak with the assembled group and explain everything to see if things went, then that would have been fine. But at the initial stages, to speak to Mr. Johnson and convey the information that I wanted to initially seemed to me the most appropriate way to deal with that. But that was rejected. I was asked to sit in the living room along with my colleague Alex McGuire and the other persons who were present. My statement describes that, and you have this in quotations, Mr. Johnson began to outline his displeasure in the way that the Police Scotland personnel had communicated information to him, which differed and conflicted significantly. He intimated that he wished to make a complaint regarding this, and I outlined the appropriate channels if he wished to make a complaint to Police Scotland. Can I ask you about this meeting? You were with Alex McGuire, who you've mentioned yesterday, I think.
Yes, I was, yeah.
He was taking the role of scribe.
Yeah, and any other relevant functions that we had to undertake, and he accompanied me to the house.
Can I ask why you selected Alex McGuire? Because yesterday you gave evidence that he was not from the local area. He was not from, Strathclyde.
That's correct.
And was there a particular reason you selected Alex McGuire to go with you to see the family?
The other 4 investigators had specific functions, obviously, to deal with 2 locations, and were fully involved in that. So Alec was available at that stage.
Right. So there was nothing specific about his
No,
background
not at all.
or anything
No.
of that sort. And given the comments and quotations there that you've noted down, did you feel that the atmosphere in the house and the communication you had with the family was consistent with the description you'd heard at the Gold Group meeting from Gary McEwen about the way the family were feeling at that time?
In some ways, yes. I mean, there was clearly grief with the group, which wholly understandable in the circumstances. There was an element of anger, and there was certainly frustration, which, from what Mr. Johnston articulated and the differing pieces of information that he had, so that was fully understandable, given what had been told.
And you've talked about Mr. Johnson being displeased at the different and conflicting information that had been given to them.
Yes.
By Police Scotland. Did you take details of that?
No, I didn't write down specifics, and it really wasn't. It was kind of difficult in the circumstances, and I think that, again, if we're trying to communicate the circumstances that we had in front of us and the emotions, etc., I didn't think that would be appropriate to do that either. And I think that was just, in general terms, what I noted at some stage once I left the house.
So you didn't take notes when you were in the room?
Not in the house, no.
Did you not feel that would be appropriate in the circumstances?
No, not in the circumstances. No.
And so the operational notes you took later, were they, how long later after the meeting did you prepare that?
I don't know. I think I returned to Kirkcaldy. I don't have a recollection of, you know, sitting in the vehicle that I was in and doing that when I left the house. So it was at some reasonably early stage after that. I couldn't be more specific.
After, how long did the meeting with the family take? Do you remember?
I would be guessing maybe 15, 20 minutes, something like that.
Did you return to Kirkcaldy Police Station
I think
immediately
so.
after the meeting?
I think so, yeah.
You've talked about the family being having anger and frustration. Can you explain, was that exclusively in relation to the different and conflicting information that they'd received from Police Scotland, or was it for other reasons as well?
Like, as part of the discussions, obviously, I had to touch on the arrangements for the post-mortem, and obviously the initial feedback is aware that there was considerations that they had for other family members, specifically Mr. Bio's mother, I understand, was travelling, which I took from England somewhere. I wasn't sure where she was located, and that they did not want anything to do with that until she'd arrived and had discussions in relation to that.
Was there any mention during that meeting about concerns the family had about obviously the actions of the police officers, that they may have been due in some part to Mr. Bio's race?
No, I don't remember anything in relation to that. No.
Were there any discussions or comments made about recent events that were in the media, about recent events in Baltimore? Do you remember anything along those lines?
No, I don't recall anything.
We've heard evidence from a DC, Wayne Parker, who was responsible for delivering the death message, one of the officers responsible, and DC Andrew Mitchell, who was the other officer responsible for delivering the death message, saying there was some discussion that this incident may have been similar to one in Baltimore in America. Was there any part of the discussion you had with the family about events, recent events?
Not to my recollection, no.
Any reference by the family that evening that there may concerns they had that there may have been a racial element in the death of Mr. Bio?
No.
To what extent were you aware that this would be a significant event publicly, that, say, a man had died after contact with the police, and he was a black man? To what extent was that something that you were conscious of on the 3rd of May?
Yes, I was conscious of it, and I knew that certainly there would be a lot in the media in relation to it. There would be a focus on the events and the subsequent investigation.
And to what extent did that awareness or that consciousness of that impact on your role as lead investigator on the 3rd of May?
It was just one of many considerations. That, I was certainly aware of it. I wasn't blind to it. That's certainly the case.
And when you say you were not blind to it, how did that awareness translate in terms of any actions that you took or any steps you took as part of the investigation?
It was all part of the thinking and consideration of any of the actions. I don't know if you're focusing specifically on the media attention side of things or just in general.
Well, let's look at the media. Did you take any particular steps in relation to the media on the 3rd of May that we would like to hear about?
No, I fed back information and briefed Mr. Casey regularly on that, who was liaising with our media representative for the PIRC at that time, and with, I understand, Crown as well in relation to any media releases. So he dealt with that.
Are
So-
PIRC responsible for liaising with the media in a situation like that where there is a PIRC investigation going on?
Yeah, in those circumstances, not directly, but they would liaise with their counterparts within Police Scotland or what other agency was involved, and obviously because it was an investigation referred by Crown, they would communicate with them also in relation to any media releases that were being considered.
Were you involved on the 3rd of May with any discussions about press releases or media interest or anything along
Not
those
from our
lines?
recollection, not directly, no, other than feeding information into the process.
I'd like to, you've mentioned the arrangements for the post-mortem. I'd like to move on to that.
Yes.
Can we look at paragraph 55 of your inquiry statement? Right. And it says here, after explaining to the family regarding the PIRC role and function, I then advised the family that Crown Office had made arrangements for a post-mortem examination on the afternoon of Monday, the 4th of May. So by the time you visited the family in the evening on the 3rd of May, you'd had a conversation with David Green, had you, about
Yes.
post-mortem arrangements. And you were aware that arrangements had been made for a post-mortem the following day.
Yes.
And you said, I asked for 2 family members to make themselves available to attend the city mortuary in Edinburgh to identify the body. And then you make a reference to page 9 of your operational notes. I don't know if you want to have a look at them as we go through it. I'll read out the quotation here. It states that Addy stated the family had discussed matters and no representatives were willing to do the identification until family members, including the now deceased mother, attended. She was travelling with a group including elders from England. My understanding of this was that the family were refusing to do the identification in the timescale outlined. I don't think it was the intention that it would be the mother that would do the identification, but that they were not willing to participate in that process until she arrived. I'm aware she was travelling from down south or was about to travel. I don't have any recollection of being advised as to when she would arrive. I got the impression she was in the process of travelling, but I don't think established where she was actually coming from, other than it was somewhere in England. I think it was suggested that they would arrive at some time the following day, which was the Monday, and obviously the post-mortem was arranged for midday on the Monday. I have been asked if the family understood that I was the Crown's decision. I think that should maybe be it.
Yeah.
It was the Crown's decision as to the timing of the post-mortem. Yes, I think so. I'd explained specifically it was the Crown's decision. My statement records that Mr. Johnson wasn't willing to be more specific on the expected arrangements of the arrival of the family members, etc. That part of the conversation was closed down. So I'd like to go through the circumstances of this, if I may. First of all, when you say there that part of the conversation was closed down, who closed the conversation down?
I think the discussion we had in direct relation to that had been exhausted by that stage. Mr. Johnson had clearly articulated the family position that it was significant to them that they could make no further decisions or arrangements in relation to who would carry out that function in relation to the post-mortem until they arrived, and the timing of that was unspecific. So I think what is meant by that is the conversation ended. We were both, on both sides, were clear what the respective positions were, and it was then just to communicate that information back to Crown at an early stage to see how that would be approached the following day.
Where did this conversation take place?
In the living room.
And who was present during this conversation?
Mr. Johnson, his wife, and several other people from memory. It all took place. There was a short conversation, I don't know whether it was when I was leaving the house or when I first entered, that took part, I think, in the hallway at the front door, but that was brief. But I'm sure that the vast majority of the conversation we had was with the collective group of people that were there.
And do you remember Colette Bell being present?
No,
Or her mother?
I wouldn't have known.
You wouldn't.
I wouldn't have been able to identify either of them at that stage.
Did you have a discussion about the postmortem with Colette Bell
No.
at a separate time?
No,
Had you seen her during that visit to the family?
I'm unaware of whether she was there or not. I'm not sure.
Can we look at your operational notes, please, of this meeting with the family? So it's page 9. This is PIRC 01468. And I'll try and read this out. If I get it wrong, you could perhaps point that out to
Sure.
me. So it says 2210, attended at home address at, and that's redacted, with Alex Maguire and met with family. In-house were Addie and Caddy Johnson and approximately 16 to 18 other, is that persons?
Persons, yeah.
Addie confirmed he had been elected as family spokesperson. The family appeared clearly upset and angry. Perhaps I should actually ask you to read this.
Yeah.
Do you mind? Yes.
No.
Thank you.
Addie stated that they were angered and frustrated by the differing and conflicting information provided by Police Scotland officers, and he intended to make a complaint re them. Brief overview of this process given and the requirement to make complaint to Police Scotland direct. They were advised of the PIRC role and function. I outlined this would, I think it should be, it doesn't say be, a fully independent and thorough inquiry conducted by experienced investigators. I also outlined arrangements in place for the post-mortem on 4th May 2015 at Edinburgh. Addie indicated the family had discussed matters and no representatives were willing to do the identification until family members, including now deceased mother, attended.
And then carry on to the next call.
She was travelling with a group including elders from England. Addie also indicated that he intended to go to the media and consult with local councillors regarding these issues.
Thank you. So, from that description which you prepared after your meeting with the family, is it fair to say that you were made aware by the family that they were not refusing to identify the body per se, but they wished for Mr. Bio's mother to be coming up from London, and that they effectively wished the post-mortem delayed until after she had arrived in Scotland?
Yes, I would agree in general terms that was
Certainly we've heard evidence from Caddy Johnson, who said she tried to explain to PIRC that her mum, she's given evidence that her mum was in London. They'd be arranging for her to come up the next day, which would have been the Monday, and they would arrange for that and to go and identify the body once she was there. Yes. Do you agree with that evidence?
I don't remember specifically that wording, but again, it's kind of similar to my understanding that that the time frame was too short, and they wanted the relatives, particularly Mr. Bio's mother, to be there before they entered into that process.
Thank you. And we've heard, we hope to hear evidence later in the inquiry from Alistair Lewis, who was
Yes.
later appointed as the flow. And he has an entry in his flow log that you had spoken to the family on the 3rd of May, and you advised Lewis that the family's single point of contact was Addie Johnson, and you'd spoken to him regarding the need for a post-mortem. He has said in his log, this was refused regarding formal ID as mother was travelling from England with family elders.
Yeah,
So did you pass that information
Yes.
on to Alistair Lewis?
yeah, first thing in the morning.
Was that on the 4th of May?
Yes.
And again, we've not heard evidence from Dave Green in the inquiry yet. We hope to. We do have a statement from him regarding the events, and I think it's noted in your operational notes that at 23:35, so this is on the
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 third.
next column of the same day, so
Yeah.
after your meeting with the family, 3rd of May, 23:35, you actually contacted Dave Green at Crown Office, and I'll get you to read out that passage from your operational notes if
Yeah,
you
that
would.
was at 23:35.
23:35 that day.
Updated Dave Green, COPFS, re the ID issue for post-mortem. Alternative arrangements discussed for selected police officers to carry out ID function. Goes ahead.
In Dave Green's inquiry statement, if we look at SBPI 00227, and looking at paragraph 4, I think. No, I don't think I've got the right, or maybe I mean page 4. Sorry, I'll confirm the position with that. I think I have the wrong reference in my note. But what he has said in that statement is, late that night, about 23:30 hours, I think, I was advised by PIRC that the family had indicated that they would not attend the mortuary to ID Mr. Bio. I instructed that the post-mortem should proceed as arranged. My reasons for this were that in my view it was essential to ascertain the cause of Sheku Bio's death as soon as possible. Now, as I say, we've not heard evidence yet from Mr. Green, and I'm just putting those words to you because they're in a statement from him. But it would appear that his understanding during that late night conversation with PIRC was that the family had indicated they would not attend the mortuary to identify Mr. Bio. So it was not, apparently, it was not his understanding that they were effectively asking for the post-mortem to be delayed while waiting for the mother to come up from London. Do you have any comment about that? If that is indeed what he speaks to in evidence?
Other than saying that I summarised the visit to the house and specifically in relation to the response for the arrangements in place for the post-mortem at that time. And I'm fairly confident that I told them regarding the expected visitors travelling and that there would be no decision finally made on it until they had arrived. So basically accurately summarising the discussion with Mr. Johnson in relation to the arrangements for the post-mortem.
Can you think of any reason or any explanation why Mr. Green may have formed the impression from that conversation that the family were simply refusing to attend to ID Mr. Bio's body?
No, I cannot.
Now, I also understand that Mr. Green may give evidence that he expected you to call the family again after that discussion the following morning to see if they'd maybe changed their mind.
Yes,
about
I recall
the
that, and
You recall
that was done the following day as well.
And I think my understanding of Mr. Green's position is that he thought that conversation the following morning would be to see if the family had changed their mind, that they would come and identify the body. Do you remember if you had the same view? Were you trying to change the family's mind, or was it for some other reason?
Part of the reason, well, initially part of it was to introduce Alistair Lewis, but obviously one of the priorities with that first contact with the family again in the morning was to try and get that representation at the post-mortem as well.
Right. Can I ask, would there have been any reason why you couldn't have asked David Green to delay the post-mortem on the Monday?
To be honest, it's not for me to interfere in that process. I'm unaware of what the availability of the appropriate people are, including the pathologists, and what was available, whether that day or further ahead in the timescale in that. It's not for me. He was aware of all the circumstances that were relevant in relation to the scheduling of it.
We've heard evidence that ultimately the decision for post-mortem is for the Crown to make. Yes. I wonder to what extent PIRC could be persuasive in relation to the timing of the post-mortem, where PIRC are aware of particular wishes being expressed by the family.
Well, that had occurred earlier in the day. I think we discussed that previously, where there was an initial consideration for having the post-mortem that day, and on that occasion I was asked by Mr. Green for an opinion in relation to that.
So you gave your opinion to David Green on the 3rd of May?
At his request, yeah.
At his request or his invitation?
Yes, his invitation.
In relation to the timing of the post-mortem?
Yeah, whether it was feasible or practical in the circumstances, and my response was, particularly at that early stage, not knowing too much about it at that stage, that I didn't view it as practical at all. So that was, I think, then thereafter was dismissed as a consideration. And
so he took on board on the 3rd, earlier on the 3rd, he took on board your comments and did not have that post-mortem
I assume so.
that
I don't
day.
know if it was directly attributable to that or otherwise.
Well, we know that the post-mortem didn't take place
Yes,
on the
we
Sunday. Did you not feel that you could again offer an opinion and perhaps persuade him to delay the post-mortem on the Monday?
I didn't choose to give an opinion or apply any specific request in that regard. He was, I said, fully aware of everything that I was aware of at that time and the circumstances regarding the family. Obviously, you've mentioned already from what you've told me that his major consideration, and I fully appreciate that, was to, in the absence of other information that we didn't have at the time, was to, as soon as practical, to get a cause of death.
In the circumstances you were in on the Sunday and the Monday, there were no flows deployed to the family?
No.
The family had expressed concerns. They were upset, angry, frustrated. Can you explain why you didn't choose to give your opinion to David Green about perhaps delaying or deferring the post-mortem until the mother had arrived?
I say I didn't know what the alternatives were. Again, that wouldn't be something that I would ask him. He's a very senior member of the Crown Office, and I didn't feel it was my position to push for any sort of alternative. He was armed with all the relevant information on the feelings of the family in relation to that, and he's clearly had uppermost in his mind as regards finding out medically what hopefully caused the death at that stage, which was very important for the investigation moving forward. So I chose not to pursue anything else in relation to those arrangements. He knew what the facts were.
Thinking about that communication between you and David Green, you've said it wasn't your position to do that. Did you feel on an equal footing with David Green? Because you're lead investigator of PIRC, you're in charge of the investigation into Mr. Byles' death. He's asked your opinion previously, and he is a member of Crown Office, a senior member. Did you feel he had more authority than you, or you couldn't speak to him on an equal footing?
Oh, no, I couldn't speak to him, but certainly on that topic, that was for him to decide, as long as he had the full facts that were available at the time.
Do you feel he did have the full facts about the family's concerns and their wishes?
Yes, I do.
Thank you. I wonder if that might be an appropriate time to end.
Yes, well, we'll stop for 20 minutes. Ms. Graham.
Thank you. I'd like to move on to the 4th of May, and you'll see in your operational notes actually that on page 9 that we were looking at before, you head up Monday the 4th of May. So you were still in the office, I think you said, that day.
Yes, I was.
And I'll be asking you about some items on page 10. I'm interested in the call you made to Addie Johnson at 10:30. So that's on page 10 of your operational notes, which are PIRC 101468. Was that 01468? I think an extra one has slipped in there. And it's page 10 that I'm interested in. Now, before I look at this on the screen, I think you've already said that you made a call to Addie Johnson on the morning of the 4th of May.
Yes.
And one of the reasons was to attempt to introduce him to Alistair Lewis, who was going to be the flow.
Yeah.
And if we look at the operational notes on the left-hand side, halfway down that page, you'll see 10:30 call to Addie Johnson. I wonder if I can ask you to read that out, please.
Call to Addie Johnson, confirm family not willing to attend the post-mortem and identify body. I confirmed to him that Crown directed post-mortem to go ahead as planned. I asked if I could attend this morning with Alistair Lewis to introduce Flo. He declined and stated he was in discussion with solicitor who would contact PIRC on their behalf. I arranged to call back and provide him with a contact number for Alistair Lewis.
And then is that another call to Addie Johnson at 10:50
Yes.
at the bottom of that page? And can you read that entry, please?
Call to Addie Johnson's mobile, no response. Message left to contact PIRC. Alistair Lewis on Flow Mobile. Also left message with Caddy Johnson at home address to have Addie contact Alistair Lewis.
On the number.
On the number provided, sorry.
And then it says update from Alistair Lewis. Is that when you had a discussion with Alistair Lewis?
Yes, I don't know, there's obviously not a time against that, but it's running at some point that morning. Deceased family have appointed Amar Anwar solicitor to represent family. I think there's a mobile number there. Alistair spoke to Mr Anwar and will take a few days to collate information. He is making a complaint to local Chief Superintendent re Caesar and search of, and there was an address there.
Right. And so the call you make to Addie Johnson on the morning of the Monday is just before you are advised that Amar Anwar has
Yes.
been instructed as the solicitor representing the family.
That's correct.
And let's look at your inquiry statement, paragraph 59, please. And this is also in connection with that telephone call to Mr Johnson at 10:30.
Yes.
This was an attempt to introduce the family liaison officer, Alistair Lewis. Mr Johnson was asked again regarding the availability of somebody to carry out the identification of Sheku Bayo, and he declined to do that. There wasn't any extension to that. That would require more time to consider it or whether people would be available. I have no recollection of any further discussion. I wonder if you can explain what's written there. So, Mr Johnson, you asked Mr Johnson on the phone about the availability of somebody to carry out the ID of the body, and he declined to do that. Now, obviously, in the operational notes from the 3rd of May in the evening of the visit with the family,
Yes.
they didn't want to identify the body until the mother came from London.
Yes.
So it was conditional upon the mother's arrival. But here it says he was asked about availability of somebody to carry out identification, and he declined to do that. And then you see,
sorry.
no, then you go on to see there wasn't any extension to that. And I'm just wondering what that sentence there actually means.
I mean, there was no further conversation during that call in relation to the arrangement. So the function of the phone call was twofold. Was, you know, make arrangements to introduce Alistair Lewis, but to revisit the discussions that I had with Mr Johnson the day before, if one, things had moved on, or whether there was a reconsideration of being involved in that process. I don't know whether I don't think I get an update of whether any of the relatives had arrived at that stage. The conversation wasn't that involved.
Right. Did you speak about the arrival of the mother, Mr Bio's mother?
I can't recall that. I think I would have mentioned that if I had.
Do you remember if you asked about the mother, her travel plans?
I don't recall, I'm afraid.
Was there any reason why you felt you couldn't ask for an update on the
I
mother's
don't think
arrival?
so. That may have been part of the conversation to establish if she'd actually arrived or not, but I don't recall that specifically, and I've not noted anything in that regard.
Was there any, do you remember asking about the timing of arrival, or when she was expected, or anything along those lines?
No, I don't remember anything further in relation to that.
Can I ask, when you were on the call with Mr Johnson, did you take the view that there was a change in the family's position on that morning, or hardening of the family's position? Or was your impression their position had not changed since the previous night?
Yeah, I don't think their position had changed. I wouldn't say it's hardened. There'd obviously been discussions, other discussions, and obviously they got the intimation that later that they'd contacted a named solicitor to represent the family. And
thank you. And when you noted at that subsequent entry in your operational notes that Mr Anwar was representing them, you say he was to represent the family. Did you know who the family was? The identification of the family members? Was he representing the whole family?
well, Mr Johnson had been nominated as representing the wider family, was my understanding, which included his wife and I would assume Mr Bio's mother and any other relevant family members. So that kind of point of contact in relation to the family, was my understanding, was being passed to the solicitor.
What about Colette Bell, Mr Bio's partner and the mother of his baby?
Whether that was part of the group being represented, maybe I didn't have any knowledge of that either way.
Did you seek to clarify that?
No.
We know that mention had been made of Colette Bell in the Gold Group minutes, the Gold Group meeting minutes. She'd been brought to Kirkcaldy Police Office.
Yes.
A statement had been taken in Kirkcaldy. There's mention of this in the minutes. There's mention of the death message having been delivered to her at Kirkcaldy Police Office.
Yes.
And the officers had sought the details of the next of kin from Miss Bell. Did you raise the issue of Miss Bell at all?
No, I did not.
Is that the sort of thing that Flows
Yes.
would be involved in?
I would anticipate that would be part of the subsequent discussions they would have with the family, and that sort of the significant and relevant network of individuals that had to be kept informed or information had to be obtained from would be identified, and that would be dealt with moving forward.
So someone such as Alistair Lewis may be able to assist us with this,
very
but
much so.
part of his role as Flo would be to define the family members and
Yes.
explore the wider family, as
Yes.
you say. There's no reference in these operational notes for the morning of the 4th of May, or even later that day, of you calling David Green back to update him about the family's position on the post-mortem. Was there a call with David Green later that day?
I don't know if anyone, I didn't, but I'm not sure if anyone else part of the PIRC did or not.
And did you ask anyone else to call David Green and update him about the family's?
I don't think so, no.
Would anyone, given that you were the one who had the conversation with the family on the 3rd and with Mr. Johnson on the morning of the 4th, is there anyone else in PIRC who could have updated David Green or would have been aware that he was expecting a call?
It's possible. I mean, I think by that time Billy Little was in the office and other senior managers within the PIRC, so they would be aware of the update from these early conversations that morning.
Did you consider on the morning after your conversation with Mr. Johnson phoning David Green again and asking him to reflect on the timing of the post-mortem?
I don't have any recollection. I said that information would have been passed for definite. Whether there was further dialogue with Mr. Green on that topic, that's outweighs my knowledge.
When you say the information would have been passed, what do you mean?
And generally the update of the conversation that the position was still that the family would not become directly involved in that, and conversation, clearly there was going to be conversation with the family solicitor as a follow-up to that conversation, and hopefully the introduction of Alistair Lewis formally to the family.
So you think the information would have been passed to David Green, is that?
No, I'm saying the other PIRC managers were definitely aware of what came out of that telephone conversation. I don't know what happened thereafter and whether there was any conversation with Mr. Green.
Well, it may be that we'll hear from Mr. Green. And so on that morning, after the call with Mr. Johnson, your operational notes obviously deal with that call, a number of calls before that, and then an update at 4 o'clock. There are fewer entries for the 4th of May than there were for the 3rd of May.
Yes.
Was this the day that you handed over the role of lead investigator to Billy Little?
Yeah, I don't know exactly what time that was, but it was fairly early on the morning of the 4th of May.
And is there any note in your operational notes about that handover to Billy
No.
Little? Or is there any paperwork that describes the briefing that you gave to Billy Little?
I don't think so, no. Other than it would be very much based on the document that I created at the very latter stages of the 3rd,
Right.
which he would have a copy of that.
I'll come on to that and we can have a look at that in a moment. Before I do that, can I ask you some questions about Colette Bell?
Sure.
At any stage, either on the 3rd or on the 4th, did you receive confirmation from anyone, Addie Johnson, anyone at all, that either Mr. Johnson or subsequently Amar Anwar was to be the single point of contact for her?
Not to my knowledge, no.
Did you at any time ask if Colette Bell was of the same view as the other family members, Addie Johnson, about not wanting to identify the body until the mother had come from London?
No, I'm unaware of that.
Now, looking back now, obviously with the benefit of hindsight, do you think that perhaps that would have been a sensible thing to do, to contact Colette Bell herself direct to discuss the post-mortem arrangements?
Possibly in hindsight, and whether she may have offered to do that identification.
I'd like to talk to you about some evidence we've heard from Colette Bell on day 40, February last year. She had said when she was in the police station, she had been under the impression that if she got her statement done, so the statement that was given in Kirkcaldy Police Office that morning, if she got that done, then she'd be able to go and see Sheku Bayo. And her mum had said to her, let's just do the statement and then maybe you'll get to see him after. And then in relation to the post-mortem, she had found out that the post-mortem had already taken place, but only on the Tuesday, so the 5th, or after the 4th certainly, when she was in Amar Anwar's office. And she gave evidence to the inquiry that she was under the impression that they needed permission to do the post-mortem. She says, I remember when I was in the police station, they had said they would need to be identified, so nothing could go ahead without him being identified anyway. And I just remember thinking, but he hasn't been identified, so how have they managed to do the post-mortem? It was my understanding that they would need permission to do that. And she says, I remember on the 3rd of May, I stayed up really, really late, obviously upset, but I kept thinking, why have they not contacted me to go and see him yet? And I remember saying to my mum, I thought they were going to phone me to go and see Sheik. And then I was like, but I don't have a number to get in contact with them. Surely they'll just get in contact with us, because I had made it very, very clear to them that I wanted to see him. Were you aware that Colette Bell wanted to see Sheku Bayo?
No, I was never made aware of that.
Who would you have expected to tell you about that?
It would come through Police Scotland and probably more than likely Pat Campbell.
Would you consider that from information about Colette Bell to be important for you to know that she really wanted to see Sheku Bayo?
Yes, and that would be, again, significant information that would be passed to the family liaison officer.
And when you say passed to the family liaison officer, am I right in saying not just to the family liaison officer?
It would be passed to PIRC, obviously, in the first place, but then that would be the primary person to be subsequently made aware. And
would you also be a person that should be made aware of that?
On the 3rd, certainly, yeah.
She said she didn't realise there were different ways that a body could be identified. And I asked her about the impact of her not seeing Sheku Bayo prior to the post-mortem. And she said, I'd asked her what impact has not being able to see him before the post-mortem had on you. And her answer was really bad. I think because I didn't get to say goodbye, I didn't get to see him. Even now I think maybe they still got it wrong. Like I know they didn't get it wrong. I know it was Sheik, but I often find myself thinking, maybe they did get it wrong. Maybe it wasn't actually him. I often have nightmares and things about it that I'll be walking down a beach on holiday and Sheik will be coming towards me. And I think it's just I didn't have that closure and I didn't have that time to say goodbye because it was so sudden. And then not being able to see him, it's had a massive impact on me. I wonder if you'd like, hearing that evidence perhaps for the first time, I wonder if you'd like to comment, given the impact that not having the opportunity to view the body has had on Colette Bell.
I can understand that, and she's conveyed that quite vividly in what she said.
And so, looking back now, do you think that getting in touch with Colette Bell and speaking to her directly about the post-mortem might have been a very valuable thing to do?
Possible.
You only think possibly. She's also given evidence to the inquiry about the visit to the evening. She said it was around 10 o'clock, and she thinks it was people maybe from PIRC. So she wasn't able to name anyone, but we know that you and Mr. Maguire attended after 10 that evening. Her impression at the time was that you were very rude and quite aggressive. Not you specifically, but the people from PIRC. And she says, I just remember them being very rude and quite aggressive. I just remember thinking, I just wish you would go away. She was to make a list, she said after that, of things she would need from the house. And she asked for Sheik's pillow and a hoodie of his. Do you have any comment to make about that evidence, the impression that people from PIRC were rude and aggressive?
I mean, the people collectively, I would think that I did the vast majority of the talking, if not all of it, during that time. So it's not in relation to the organisation that would be directed, I would assume, at me. It's very disappointing to hear that. Obviously addressed that in some of the comments that I made, that she wasn't the only member of the family that had made similar comments. I said, I started off the initial conversations with, quite rightly, giving condolences to the family and understanding the position they were in, how they must have felt at that particular time. It was extremely difficult circumstances, and it's incomprehensible for me to be unprofessional and rude and arrogant in any sort of way. That just is not the reflection of any of the discussion or period of time that I spent in the house.
You're not a trained flow.
No.
And I wonder if there were trained flows in the house that evening, that late point in the evening, do you think that would have aided the communication with the family in relation to matters to do with Mr. Bio?
It's hard to, I can only focus on how I think the conversation with the various family members went and my recollection of that. And I've spoken to many individuals and family representatives over a long number of years, passing death messages, speaking about deceased victims. I've done that an awful lot, so I do have a lot of past experience in that. I think I know how to approach people with empathy and understand the circumstances. So I say again, it's very disappointing to hear that that's the perception of how I was received and what I said at the time.
We've heard evidence that delivering a death message and speaking to bereaved families can be a particularly difficult job for police officers.
Of course I can.
Is that something that you would agree with? And is that a similar experience for officers, from investigators from PIRC, although you're not necessarily delivering a death message, being in that environment with bereaved families?
We still have the need to talk to people and communicate with them in relation to these very difficult sets of circumstances, and everybody's response to that situation is very different and can be sometimes significantly different, and you have to adapt to those circumstances as that develops.
In relation to Addie Johnson, we have an inquiry statement which indicates that he also considered the approach of yourself and Mr. Maguire as being arrogant. And he further stated in paragraph 25 of his statement, they talked down to us as though we were idiots, black people who didn't have a clue. But of course, like the police, they were left in shock at the questions we asked and our failure to comply with their stereotypes. Do you have any comment to make about that statement by Mr. Johnson?
No, other than I would just reiterate, it's very unfortunate and disappointing from my perspective that there is that sort of perception.
In relation to the accusation that they talked down to us as though we were idiots, do you feel that's a fair reflection of the way you were
Not
speaking?
at all, not at all.
And the suggestion that you thought black people didn't have a clue, do you have any comment to make about that?
Definitely not. Think that for a minute.
Where he said, like the police, they were left in shock at the questions we asked. Did you have surprise or shock about questions that were asked by the family?
I wouldn't say so. I mean, if there was questions in that regard put across, I don't have any recollection of questions of that being asked. I certainly, I said, I went there with a purpose to communicate with the family, display some empathy and try for them to get an understanding of how things would move forward and spend as long a time there as was required.
And when you were with the family that evening on the 3rd of May, did you have in your mind, either when you went to the house or during your time in the house, did you have any stereotypes or racial stereotypes in your head as to how the family would be or how they would communicate with you?
Absolutely not, no.
Let's move on to the briefing document that you mentioned a moment ago. And I think you said this is PIRC 03694, and I think you said that you'd prepared this on the 3rd of May, and the date is given at the top as the 3rd of May. Was this prepared over a period of hours, or was it prepared in one go? When did you start preparing this?
I don't really know the starting time. It was probably a small part of it done during a period at Kirkcaldy Police Station, and probably the majority was done when I get back to the office, I recall.
And
our own offices, sorry.
did you go back to the office on the 3rd, or did you go back to your office on the 4th?
No, back to our office on the 3rd.
Right. So was this after your visit to the family you returned to Hamilton?
Yes.
And so the calls that you made after your visit to the family, to Green and Pat Campbell, were they from the car or from the Hamilton office?
It could be either or, I'm not quite sure. I know the call to Mr. Green was a fair length of time after, but I couldn't be 100% sure where I was, whether it was while we were driving or whether it was back at the office.
So we know that you attended at the family's home at 2210.
Yeah.
From page 9 of your operational notes, and then the call to David Green's at 2335.
Yeah, so
Does that help you?
yeah, we probably, I reckon about 25 minutes maybe at Mr. Johnson's home, which would take us to maybe 25 to 11, 20 to 11. So close to an hour probably after that I eventually spoke to David Green.
So do you think during that period you were travelling back to Hamilton?
I don't remember how long I spent at Kirkcaldy when I'm back. In fact, I'm not 100% sure actually whether we just drove straight from the Johnsons and then straight back to Hamilton. It's quite vague as far as whether I went back to Hamilton, to Kirkcaldy Police Station for a short time or not.
All right. Let's look at this briefing note. It's a briefing note for Director of Investigations. My understanding that at that time the Director of Investigations was John Mitchell.
That's correct.
And I understand that he will say that he returned to work on the 5th of May, which was the Tuesday.
Yeah. as far as who that's for the information, well, that would be kind of standard practice, but that document would be for sharing with the PIRC managers and potentially used as a briefing document in some fashion for investigators as well. But it would still be headed for the Director of Investigations, just as a standard process.
So this document could be used on the 4th of May, and I asked you about Billy Little earlier today.
Yeah.
Was this document used when you briefed Billy Little?
I don't know if it was used, but he would have sight of that, as would the other PIRC managers that were on duty first thing that morning.
Right. So would they receive copies of that?
Yeah, I think it would have been circulated at the time. They would certainly have seen it.
When on the 4th of May did you hand over the role of lead investigator to Billy Little?
I'd mentioned that before. I don't know. It was sometime, I think, fairly early in the morning that a decision was made. I think potentially by either one of the senior investigators or the head of investigations, Irene Scully.
And did you do a briefing at that time? Personally, give a briefing?
To the managers, yes.
To the who were the managers?
I don't know who was all present at the time, whoever was in that morning, so Billy Little would have been one of them. And I can't remember, John McSporran was there that morning, whether he came back to duty the following day, but any of the senior managers that were on duty would have been fully briefed, and that would be a part basis of what that was.
On the basis partly on the basis of this document?
And then obviously a lot of things would be added to some degree by myself.
And you would have your operational notes to rely on if necessary? Yeah. And what was your expectation after briefing the managers? Was it that they would then cascade information out to the wider team? Yeah,
where required, and getting a response or what was seen as the priority actions for later that day.
Right. Can we look at, first of all, page 2 of the briefing? At the bottom of page 1 it says incident involvement with police. So it's a summary of the information you had available, is that correct?
Yes.
And then looking at page 2, if we can look at paragraph 4 on that page. And you'll see the paragraph, it says it was reported. So this is you indicating what information you have available about the incident.
Yes.
Where it says it was reported, is that a specific reference to an individual that's reported to you?
No, I would say that's the collective from the information that we had, and forming a summary of what that was, what was known at the time.
Right. It was reported that as the officers drove into Hayfield Road, they saw the now deceased coming towards them as the vehicles came to a halt. They could clearly see he was in possession of a knife and was making his way towards them. Some of the officers, unknown how many at this stage, drew their police-issue batons. At least one of the officers also drew their pava spray and issued a warning to the now deceased, who continued to come forward. Pava was subsequently sprayed towards the now deceased. However, this had little effect. There was some reference to him laughing at the officers. It was also reported that one of the female officers was apparently kicked in the back and also sustained a blow to the back of her head. She sustained no serious injury as a result, but complained of pain. As the pava had little effect, a number of the officers struck the now deceased with their batons. It is unknown at present how often he was struck or how many officers struck him. A struggle then ensues, and the now deceased was eventually taken to the ground, where he was handcuffed to the rear. Due to his constant struggling, leg restraints were also applied to him. So on the basis of that information, that briefing document, it appears that the suggestion that the subject was the aggressor and the police responded with spray and baton again appears to be the understanding that you had at that time.
It's a collective summary of the information that I had at different stages.
So still no accounts from the officers who were at the scene.
No.
So you're still reliant at that point on the information that we looked at yesterday,
Yes.
that indicated that the subject was the aggressor. Can we look at your paragraph, please? Sorry, your inquiry statement, paragraph 139. Sorry, it's the second inquiry statement. Sorry, I should have said that. So it's paragraph 139. And this is a series of questions that you were asked about this briefing note, and in particular about page 2 and the entries that I've read out from there. I wonder if we can look at your response, please. You say, this part of the briefing document was based on the accounts provided to me in the first instance by Superintendent Craig Blackhall, then Detective Superintendent Campbell and DI Colin Robson. Now, yesterday we looked at the information you got from David Green, Craig Blackhall and Pat Campbell. I didn't ask you about information you received from Colin Robson. Was that consistent with the information you'd had from the other three, or different?
There was similarities, but there were some differences within that as well. And this was based solely on his update at the Gold Group meeting of the facts known at the time. So that was, I can't recall how much was reflected within the minutes of that, but that was notes kind of taken during the course of that meeting. Again, there were variances and subsequently inaccuracies in that as well.
Right. And this would be the second Gold Group meeting, the first one you attended,
yes.
Is that right? So can we look at those minutes again, please? PS 07268. So this is the second Gold Group meeting at 1440, and we can see that Detective Inspector Robson was present. On page 2, item 3, investigative process, it was actually spoken to by Pat Campbell. We've heard evidence about that. And it appears that Detective Inspector Robson speaks to item 5, which related to family concerns. Is it possible that it was at a different meeting or a different discussion? I wonder if you could look at...
I think it was the first Gold Group meeting.
Right. Can we look at the minutes for the first Gold Group meeting? PS 06491. And we've heard evidence from Detective Inspector Robson that he had attended that first Gold Group meeting at 11:30 in the morning. But we know that you weren't present at that. And I think you said you wouldn't have received the minutes for that. And item 2 on the agenda, starting on page 1, it says that a synopsis of events was provided by DI Robson, including circumstances of the initial calls, a verbal account of police engagement with the male, and an update on the injury to PC Short. It says towards the bottom of page 1, considerations with regards to the incident involving recording and seizure of a knife believed to have been in possession of the male, the welfare of the officers concerned and identification of significant witnesses was also outlined, and the events relating to the deceased being conveyed. So it would appear that at the first meeting that DI Robson's update indicates that there was reference to a knife believed to be in possession of the male. Doesn't seem to be anything more in the minutes with regard to that
Yeah.
update. Was that the part of the information that was shared with you?
Yeah, it's definitely. My recollection was that during one of the goal group meetings, he provided an operational update on basically what was known, and we made reference to that ultimately in this briefing document. And you know, obviously one of the significant things in relation to the knife, etc., being presented, which ultimately was not the case. So.
However, you obtained the information given by D.I. Robson. Is it fair to say that his account and the account he shared with you was consistent with the other three accounts?
In general terms,
general.
yeah, there were some differences, as I said.
Now, we may hear from John Mitchell that he was given a briefing on the 5th of May when he returned, and it was on the basis of this briefing document. So it would appear that you've talked yesterday about cascading of information. Would it appear that on the basis of your briefing note, although you stepped down from the role of lead investigator,
Yeah.
that the summary that we see on page 2 of the briefing note about, I'm calling it subject aggressor, police taking action in defence, that information was then being shared with others on the 4th of May and on the 5th of May.
I think that's likely, yeah.
And there was no information available from the police officers at that time
No.
that would have contradicted any of that.
No.
Do you know why you were removed from the role of lead investigator and Billy Little was brought in that role on the 4th, given that then John McSporran came in on the 5th?
Yeah, I think we discussed that yesterday, whereby there was awareness that I was due to go on annual leave, and that was within a period of days. I think it was near the end of that week, and the decision was made that it was more appropriate to change it immediately, so that Billy Little could run with that from day 2, effectively. As opposed to it would cause more issues, like leaving it for a period of days and then changing it thereafter. That was the more sensible decision.
Okay. Can I ask you to look at the 4th Gold Group meeting minute, PS 03161. And this was a Gold Group meeting on the 4th of May, so the Monday at 12:30. And I think in your inquiry statement you say you've no recollection of being made aware of this Gold Group meeting.
No, and I certainly wasn't there.
And by 12:30 would you have handed on the role of lead investigator?
I believe so, yeah.
We've also heard evidence that no one from PIRC was present at this meeting. Are you aware why Billy Little didn't attend this meeting?
No, I'm not.
Do you have any recollection on that morning of hearing of concerns that were being expressed by Police Scotland of the handover and the change of lead investigator between?
I don't think about the lead investigator, but I think there's, in my operational notes, there's reference to a call with ACC Nicholson, but I think that was partly, I think, to do with the range of the investigation at that time, and also some issues being raised about the introduction of the flows and perceived delays in that. But as we've discussed, that was ongoing from first thing in the morning.
So that was between Little and Nicholson, not you. You weren't involved in that.
No, I don't think I was, but I was made aware of, in general terms, that the concerns, let's call them, that were being raised at that time.
Okay. So you were still being kept in the loop to some extent on the 4th of May?
Yeah, I was aware. I was in the office for a major part, if not all of the day, so I was aware of
And
various
were
things that
you
were going on.
available to other investigators if they'd
Yes.
wished to come and speak to you?
Yes.
Did any of them come and speak to you specifically about this investigation?
I don't have any specific recollections. I spoke to a number of them. Obviously, I spoke to Alistair Lewis at length, Billy Little as well, and I would have spoken to others, but as far as relaying what conversations took place, I wouldn't really confirm that.
Tell us about your conversation with Billy Little. Do you remember?
Not a great deal about it, other than I would have gone through, basically summarised the whole incident, the actions that had been taken, potentially we would have discussed the issues in relation to the post-mortem, and obviously there was things late in the day that had to be arranged in relation to that. So, and that was, I think various people were tasked to do various actions in relation to that.
We've got the minutes of this Gold Group meeting on the screen. Can we look at page 2? This is effectively item 3 on the agenda, investigative process, spoken to by DI Stuart Wilson. And if we can go just above halfway down, there are some tasks identified above item 4 on the agenda. And it says here, so PIRC were not present at this meeting, we've heard.
I'm not sure. I don't know whether I'm pretty sure Billy Little was not there, but I'm unsure whether there may have been another representative there that's not listed.
We can maybe ask Billy Little to clarify that, but certainly you weren't present at
No,
this
I
meeting.
definitely wasn't present.
So the task here is advice to be gained from PIRC regarding the disclosure of the PM results to the officers involved in the incident. Supervisor to be identified to carry this disclosure out. I'm interested in whether you had any knowledge about this suggestion that the results of the post-mortem should be disclosed to the officers involved.
No, I wasn't a party to any discussions in that regard.
And you weren't aware of any of that then, that day?
Not then, but obviously post, I'm aware.
I'd like to move on then, please, and talk to you about the 13th of May. I don't know if you were back from holiday that day or if you were still on holiday.
No, I wouldn't have been back. I think I was away for 2 weeks at least. Probably went away around about, say, the end of that week or that weekend. So.
Right. Well, I'd just like to ask you for your general view. Obviously, you were acting as lead investigator at one time in this investigation, and you're a very experienced member of staff at PIRC, and we have some evidence available to the chair that Addy Johnson gave a statement to PIRC, and I'll summarise this for you. He describes having a meeting with DC Mitchell and DC Parker. They were the two officers who delivered the death message on the afternoon of the 3rd of May. So they're Police Scotland officers. And he said in that statement, he was told, if I can summarise 4 things, that Mr. Bio was pronounced dead in the ambulance on the way to the hospital. They didn't know how Mr. Bio had died. The police were looking for 2 guys, and there had been a warrant out for the arrest of Mr. Bio. Now, obviously there are differences between what people say they delivered as part of the death message and what the family say they were told as part of the death message. And I'm not asking you to comment on any of that, but I am interested in the fact that after Mr. Johnson gave that statement to PIRC, nobody went back to Mitchell and Parker and asked them to comment on these different statements that had been made. And I'm wondering, in your perspective, whether you think as lead investigator that would be a topic of some interest to the PIRC investigation into the way that the family had been handled. Do you think that maybe someone should have gone back to Mitchell and Parker to ask about this?
I don't know if you will have, because I seem to have some recollection I was possibly present when Mitchell was interviewed. Possibly, there's something that's there that I don't know to what extent that was and what that actually incorporated. I think, I mean, it's clearly relevant information, particularly in relation to, did you mention two persons that were of interest? That,
police looking for two guys.
Which.
Now this was on the 13th of May that Mr. Johnson gave this statement. So you were on holiday the day he gave the statement. But that would be the point at which PIRC would have something in writing about this issue.
Yeah, I mean, the statement all statements would be read in detail, and any actions highlighted within that were appropriate to follow up, whether that was re-interview or interview other persons in relation to that. But obviously I can't comment on what was done with that statement and specifically that information.
Given, if you take from me that PIRC had that statement and it contained some concerns that the family had about the information they were being given, do you think that's the type of thing that PIRC would ordinarily want to go back and ask officers about, given the disparities?
What information they had already, whether it was viewed that there was an answer to that question already, but and that's hypothetical. That is one potential outcome from it. So without knowing the specific facts and the reasoning when that statement was read, that wasn't warranted as following up, it's hard to say.
So if they had an explanation or another statement that explained the situation, then they may not go back to Mitchell and Parker.
That's possible.
If they didn't have an explanation or an understanding of how this disparity had arisen, in that situation, would you expect PIRC to go back to Mitchell and Parker?
I would expect the information to be, if it was thought as relevant and important, that it would be bottomed out in a whatever fashion and if that, that may mean further interviews, as I said, or establishing from elsewhere, someone else.
And then, so that was the 13th of May that Mr. Johnson gave the statement. On the 12th of June, so roughly a month later, and after the PIRC had received statements from the officers on the 4th of June, the terms of reference for PIRC were expanded by Crown Office to include investigating allegations by the family that they'd been provided with misleading and erroneous information concerning the death of Mr. Bio. So at that point there was an instruction from Crown for PIRC to formally investigate this aspect. We had the statement from Mr. Johnson, or you had the statement from Mr. Johnson, and the formal instruction from Crown.
Yep.
At that point, would you expect an investigator from PIRC to go back to Mitchell and Parker and ask follow-up questions?
Well, clearly, what you've outlined as far as an additional direction incorporates what you're talking about from what you've conveyed there. So the answer to that would be yes.
Right, thank you. It appears that they were never asked about Mr. Johnson's allegations, Mitchell and Parker, about this misleading and erroneous information. Looking back now, do you think that that was maybe an omission that should have been rectified by PIRC?
There may be an explanation for that. I have no knowledge of that other than that there was an extension of the direction from Crown in relation to that, but it's hard to tell without looking at the detail of these statements and what actions were subsequently identified as a result of that additional Crown direction.
So again, if there was maybe some other source of information available to PIRC that provided the explanation or the answer to any apparent disparity, PIRC would not need to go back.
Yeah.
But in the absence of that, they probably should have gone back to Mitchell and Parker.
When that additional direction came in, I'm sure there was a thorough approach to that in identifying what actions had to be completed, who had to be interviewed to fully exhaust that line of inquiry, what would be required.
Right. Can I ask you questions about the 8th of July? So again, moving on. And I'd like to ask you about Kirsty MacLeod. Now, we've heard evidence that she was the partner, now the wife, of Martin Dick.
Yeah.
Now, initially, when the police were investigating the events leading up to Mr. Bio's arrival at Hayfield Road, that was one of the properties that they were involved in.
Yeah, I'm aware of that. Yeah.
You talked yesterday about a parallel investigation. Kirsty MacLeod was gave an initial statement, but she was questioned again on the 8th of July, so 2 months after Mr. Bio had died, and she was asked questions about where Mr. Bio had obtained his drugs. We've heard evidence he'd taken illicit drugs on the 3rd of May. I'm interested in why PIRC, if you know, wanted to explore that avenue as part of the PIRC investigation. That you would go back and to Kirsty MacLeod a second time and ask her questions about Mr. Bio's supply of drugs. It wasn't part of the terms of reference directed by the Crown Office, I should say, for the avoidance of any doubt. So why would that be of interest to PIRC?
Who the actual supplier was,
Yes.
or what commodity?
Where he obtained his drugs, who the supplier was.
There could be a number of reasons. One of them, in particular, what drugs had at any time specifically been supplied, if that was the case.
Right. Well, the question was about where he obtained his drugs, not about what drugs he obtained.
But that may be part of the reason for establishing that, is to subsequently identify what kind of drugs.
So you think that might have been an interesting part of the investigation?
I've got very little knowledge in relation to that, the kind of behind those actions. I've certainly visited that house. I don't know if I spoke to that lady or not. I was there at one that it may have been to speak to Martin Dick, possibly.
We have, this is the 8th of July, we have a statement from a Brian Dodd.
Yeah.
You know Brian Dodd?
Yeah.
He has given the inquiry a statement, and he speaks to the questioning of Kirsty MacLeod around the potential supply chain associated with Mr. Bio's drugs. He says, and I quote, "I was not involved in the decision-making process regarding these matters. I believe that this would be public safety related." So he suggests that perhaps it was a public safety matter, and that's why Kirsty MacLeod was approached for another time and asked about the supply of drugs. Would you think that's a plausible explanation?
It's a possibility, but there could be others. It's fairly speculative without knowing any specific facts surrounding what the reason behind an action being raised to re-interview that individual to establish that information.
Would that be a matter for the lead investigator to maybe speak to? Well, we can maybe ask Mr. McSporran. So, I mean, out of interest, do PIRC have a public duty or a statutory authority to investigate issues of public safety in terms of the supply of drugs?
Not to investigate it, but if we become aware of a public safety issue, we certainly have a responsibility to report that and take action appropriately, particularly in case, you know, that information that we came across was something that led to any tragic events. So we have a responsibility to ensure that that's dealt with, I would say.
Who would it be reported to?
Probably the police.
I'd like to move on to some questions about going back in a sense to when the police officers gave statements to PIRC, and that was
Yep.
on the 4th of June 2015. And I'd like to move on to that and ask you some questions, but I'm also conscious of the time, so would you give me a moment, please? Would that be a...
Yes, we'll stop for lunch there and sit at 2 o'clock.